Laughter died in Lydia Parker's throat as the back of her master's hand connected with her cheek, sending her sprawling across the dusty floor of the general store in Redemption Creek, Colorado. The year was 1875, and for a woman like her, an indentured servant with 6 more years of service, laughter was apparently a luxury she couldn't afford. "You find something amusing, girl," Mr. Harlow sneered, his bloated face reddening further as he towered over her trembling form. "Perhaps you'd care to share the joke with everyone here." Lydia pressed her lips together, tasting blood from her split lip as she struggled to her knees. She hadn't meant to laugh, it had simply bubbled up unexpectedly when she'd witnessed Mr. Harlow's pompous strut falter as he'd nearly tripped over a barrel. A genuine accident, a moment of human clumsiness that had triggered her natural response. The store had fallen silent. Other customers, respectable townsfolk who'd known her for the 3 years she'd been Mr. Harlow's property, averted their eyes. No one would speak for her, no one ever did. "I asked you a question, girl." Mr. Harlow's voice dropped dangerously low as he grabbed her arm, yanking her to her feet. "I'm sorry, sir," Lydia whispered, keeping her eyes downcast. Her long brown hair had come loose from its severe bun, falling across her face in a curtain that hid her humiliation. "It won't happen again. You're right about that." Mr. Harlow's grip tightened painfully. "I've had enough of your insolence, been too soft on you, that's the problem, Mr. Diggs." The storekeeper cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should finish our business, Harlow. The lady's flour and sugar, the lady." Mr. Harlow barked a harsh laugh. "This isn't a lady, Diggs. This is property that's forgotten its place." He shoved Lydia toward the counter. "Finish loading our purchases. We're leaving." Lydia moved mechanically, gathering the remaining packages with shaking hands. Her cheek throbbed where he'd struck her, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest. 3 years ago, at 19, she'd signed the indenture papers after her parents died, leaving her with their debts. It had seemed the only way to survive. She'd never imagined that survival would come at such a cost. The bell above the door jingled as a tall figure stepped into the store, bringing with him the scent of leather, horses, and the wide open plains. The newcomer paused just inside the entrance, pushing his hat back with one finger to reveal a face weathered by sun and wind. "Afternoon," he said, his deep voice carrying easily through the tense atmosphere. Lydia didn't dare look up, but she could feel the stranger's presence like a physical force as he moved further into the store. "Griffin Blackwood." The man introduced himself to Mr. Diggs with a tip of his hat. "Just rode in from Wyoming territory, looking to stock up before heading to my new spread outside town." "Welcome to Redemption Creek, Mr. Blackwood," Diggs replied, visibly relieved by the interruption. "What can I help you with today?" Mr. Harlow huffed impatiently. "Diggs, we haven't finished our transaction." The newcomer Griffin turned slowly, taking in the scene before him. Lydia felt his gaze sweep over her, lingering on her reddened cheek and split lip, then moving to Mr. Harlow's flustered expression. "Don't mean to interrupt," Griffin said casually, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. "Take your time." Mr. Harlow puffed up like an agitated rooster. "Girl, wait outside, now." Lydia nodded silently, gathering her packages and moving toward the door. As she passed Griffin Blackwood, she caught a glimpse of startling blue eyes beneath the brim of his hat, eyes that held no pity, but something far more dangerous: interest. Outside, the Colorado sun beat down mercilessly. Lydia placed the packages in Mr. Harlow's wagon and stood beside it, keeping her head bowed. Inside, she could hear raised voices, though she couldn't make out the words. Minutes passed, and her anxiety grew. Mr. Harlow's temper would only worsen if he felt he'd been publicly challenged. When the door finally opened, Mr. Harlow emerged with a triumphant smirk that made Lydia's stomach clench with dread. "Get in the wagon," he ordered, climbing up to the driver's seat without looking at her. The ride back to the Harlow farm was conducted in ominous silence. Lydia clutched the edge of the seat as the wagon bounced along the rutted road, each jolt sending a spike of pain through her injured face. Whatever Mr. Harlow was planning, it wouldn't be good. The last time he'd been this angry, he'd locked her in the root cellar for 2 days without food. They crested the hill that overlooked the Harlow property, a modest farmhouse with a large barn, and several outbuildings spread across 100 acres of mostly unworked land. Mrs. Harlow had died the previous winter, leaving Lydia to manage both the household and most of the farm work, while Mr. Harlow spent his days drinking and complaining about his misfortunes. "I've found a solution to our problem," Mr. Harlow announced as he pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "Sir?" Lydia questioned cautiously. "You're more trouble than you're worth, girl." He turned to her with cold eyes. "I've sold your contract." The words hit Lydia like a physical blow. "Sold? My contract to whom?" "That cowboy in the store offered a fair price." Mr. Harlow smiled unpleasantly. "Said he liked your spirit. We'll see how long that lasts." Lydia's mind raced. Being sold to a stranger, especially one who'd just ridden into town, could mean anything. She might be taken far from Redemption Creek to some isolated ranch where no one would hear her screams. Or worse. "When?" she managed to ask, her voice barely audible. "He's coming for you tomorrow morning." Mr. Harlow climbed down from the wagon. "Until then, you'll sleep in the barn. Can't risk you running off and making me look bad." "But my things. You came with nothing, girl. You'll leave with nothing." He gestured toward the barn. "Get moving. And be grateful I'm not taking a strap to you for that display in town." That night, curled on a pile of hay in the corner of the barn, Lydia stared into the darkness as tears silently tracked down her face. The contract that bound her was legal, perfectly legal, and she had no recourse. Whatever this Griffin Blackwood intended for her, she had no choice but to submit. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of blue eyes and unknown dangers. Morning arrived with cruel swiftness. Lydia washed her face in the horse trough, wincing as the cool water stung her split lip. She smoothed her dress, a faded blue calico that had once belonged to Mrs. Harlow, and attempted to bring order to her long brown hair, twisting it into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Whatever awaited her, she would face it with dignity. The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent her heart racing. From the barn doorway, she watched as Griffin Blackwood rode into the yard, followed by a wagon driven by a young boy who couldn't have been more than 15. Blackwood dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. Up close, he was even more imposing than he'd appeared in the store, tall and broad-shouldered, with a lean hardness to him that spoke of a life lived on the frontier. The stubble on his jaw was a shade darker than his sandy brown hair, and those remarkable blue eyes were watchful as they swept over the property. Mr. Harlow emerged from the house, already dressed in his Sunday best despite it being Tuesday. "Blackwood," he greeted with false joviality. "Right on time." "Harlow." Griffin's response was curt. His gaze found Lydia standing in the shadow of the barn, and he studied her for a long moment before turning back to her current master. "I've brought the payment we agreed upon." "Excellent." Mr. Harlow rubbed his hands together. "The girl's contract has about 6 years remaining. She's healthy enough, though prone to insolence." Griffin didn't respond to this assessment. Instead, he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document. "I've had the transfer of indenture papers drawn up. Everything's in order, Mr." Harlow took the papers, scanning them quickly before nodding. "Looks correct." Let's conclude our business then. Griffin nodded to the boy in the wagon, who hopped down with a small strongbox. The transaction was completed with disturbing efficiency. Money changed hands, papers were signed, and just like that, Lydia's fate was decided without her having any say in the matter. "Girl," Mr. Harlow called, "get over here." Lydia forced her leaden feet to move, crossing the yard with as much composure as she could muster. Standing before the two men, she kept her eyes lowered. "This is your new master," Mr. Harlow said, the satisfaction evident in his voice. "You'll do as he says or you'll regret it." "Yes, sir," Lydia whispered. Griffin Blackwood stepped forward. "Look at me." The quiet command held such authority that Lydia found herself obeying before she could think better of it. She raised her eyes to his face, searching for some clue to his character, some hint of what he intended for her. His expression revealed nothing. "Get in the wagon," he instructed, his tone neither harsh nor particularly kind. Lydia glanced at Mr. Harlow, who nodded impatiently, then moved toward the waiting wagon. The boy who'd been driving offered her a shy smile as he helped her up to the seat. "I'm Liam, Mr. Blackwood's ranch hand," he said quietly. "Don't worry, miss, you'll be all right." Before she could respond, Griffin mounted his horse and nodded to Liam. "Let's go." As the wagon pulled away from the only home she'd known for 3 years, Lydia didn't look back. Whatever lay ahead couldn't possibly be worse than what she was leaving behind. At least, that's what she told herself as they traveled the dusty road toward an unknown future. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, following the main road out of town, before turning onto a narrower track that wound through stands of pine and aspen. The mountains rose majestically in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat in the valley. Finally, Griffin guided his horse alongside the wagon. "We'll be reaching my property soon. It's about 500 acres, most of it good grazing land." Lydia nodded, unsure if a response was expected. "I bought it from a widow who's moving east to live with her daughter," he continued. "The house is solid, needs some work, but it's weather-tight." Again, Lydia simply nodded. Griffin studied her for a moment. "You don't have much to say for yourself, do you?" "What would you have me say, sir?" Lydia asked carefully. A hint of something frustration perhaps flickered across his face. "Your name might be a start. Lydia Parker, sir." "And how old are you, Lydia Parker?" 22, sir," he nodded as if confirming something to himself. "I'm 30. Spent most of my life working other men's land. This place is the first that's truly mine." Lydia wasn't sure why he was telling her this, but she sensed it was important to him. "It sounds like you've worked hard for it, sir." "I have." His gaze moved to the horizon. "A man should own something in this world. Something that can't be taken from him." The irony of his words, spoken to a woman who had no ownership of herself, wasn't lost on Lydia. But she remained silent, recognizing that this wasn't the time to voice such thoughts. They crested a gentle rise, and suddenly the valley opened before them. Nestled against the backdrop of pine-covered hills sat a modest 2-story farmhouse with a wide front porch. A large barn stood nearby, along with a corral and several smaller outbuildings. A creek meandered through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. "Welcome to Blackwood Ranch," Griffin said, a note of pride in his deep voice. It was beautiful, far more appealing than the neglected Harlow farm. Lydia felt a tiny flicker of hope that perhaps her situation had improved, at least in terms of her surroundings. As they approached the house, a shaggy dog came bounding out to greet them, barking enthusiastically. "That's Rusty," Liam told her. "He's friendly, just noisy." Griffin dismounted and approached the wagon as Liam brought it to a stop. "Liam, take care of the horses. I'll show Miss Parker around." "Yes, sir," the boy replied cheerfully, jumping down from the seat. Griffin offered his hand to help Lydia down from the wagon. She hesitated before accepting it, noting the calluses that spoke of years of hard labor. His grip was firm but not painful as he assisted her to the ground. "This way," he said, releasing her hand immediately and gesturing toward the house. Lydia followed him up the path, acutely aware of her dusty dress and disheveled appearance. She hadn't had a proper bath in days, and her split lip and bruised cheek must make her look particularly pathetic. The front door opened into a spacious main room that served as both parlor and dining area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while large windows allowed sunlight to stream in. The furnishings were simple but of good quality: a oak dining table with 6 chairs, a comfortable-looking sofa, and several sturdy armchairs. "The kitchen's through there," Griffin pointed to a doorway at the back of the room. "Bedrooms are upstairs, 3 of them. Liam uses the small one at the back of the house." Lydia nodded, trying to take everything in. The house was clean and well-maintained, if somewhat sparsely furnished. Nothing like the perpetual mess of the Harlow household. "Are you hungry?" Griffin asked abruptly. The question caught her off guard. "Yes, sir. I haven't eaten since yesterday." Something flashed in his eyes, anger perhaps, but it was quickly contained. "We'll remedy that. Kitchen's stocked. Feel free to help yourself to whatever you need." "Thank you, sir," Lydia replied, mystified by his behavior. Most masters didn't concern themselves with whether their servants were hungry. Griffin moved to the staircase. "I'll show you your room first." Lydia followed him up the stairs, her confusion growing with each step. Servants typically slept in the kitchen or some converted storage space, not in proper bedrooms. At the top of the stairs, Griffin opened the first door on the right. "This will be your room." Lydia stepped inside and froze in astonishment. The room was lovely, spacious and bright, with a large window overlooking the creek and mountains beyond. A real bed with a proper mattress stood against one wall, covered with a colorful quilt. There was a dresser, a small writing desk, and even a rocking chair near the window. "Sir, there must be some mistake," she said, turning to him in confusion. This can't be meant for a servant." Griffin leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. "It's your room, Miss Parker, unless you'd prefer a different one. No, it's beautiful, but—" Lydia struggled to make sense of the situation. "I don't understand." "What don't you understand?" "Why you would give a servant such accommodations." Griffin studied her for a long moment before answering. "I think we need to clarify a few things. Yes, I purchased your indenture contract. Legally, you're bound to work for me until that contract expires. But I have no interest in treating another human being like property." Lydia stared at him, unable to process his words. After 3 years with Mr. Harlow, the concept of being treated as a person rather than a possession seemed impossible to grasp. "Why did you buy my contract?" she asked, the question that had been haunting her since yesterday finally escaping her lips. Griffin's expression softened slightly. "Because when that bastard hit you for laughing, I saw something worth saving." The simple statement, delivered without drama or pretense, brought unexpected tears to Lydia's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, unwilling to show such weakness. "I don't know what he told you about me," she said carefully, "but I'm not. I wasn't disobedient, You laughed," Griffin finished for her. "And from the look on his face, I'd guess that wasn't the first time he'd punished you for it." Lydia shook her head, memories flooding back. "He said it was disrespectful, that no one wanted to hear a servant's laughter." "Well, I disagree," Griffin said firmly. "This is my home, and I make the rules here. And one of those rules is that you're free to laugh whenever you damn well please." He pushed away from the doorframe and took a step back into the hallway. "Get cleaned up if you'd like. There's a washroom at the end of the hall. Then come down and have something to eat. We can talk more about how things will work here." With that, he turned and headed back downstairs, leaving Lydia alone with her thoughts. For several minutes, she simply stood in the center of her room trying to comprehend the sudden change in her circumstances. It seemed too good to be true, and experience had taught her to be wary of unexpected kindness. Men like Griffin Blackwood didn't spend good money on indentured servants out of charity. Still, the promise of a wash and food was too tempting to resist. She found the washroom equipped with a proper bathtub, pump, and even a small stove for heating water. Clean towels were stacked on a shelf, along with a bar of scented soap that smelled of lavender. After washing her face and hands and tidying her hair as best she could, Lydia made her way back downstairs. She found Griffin in the kitchen, slicing bread at a sturdy wooden table. "Feel better?" he asked without looking up. "Yes, sir, thank you." "You can drop the sir. Griffin will do fine." Lydia hesitated. Addressing a master by his first name seemed dangerously informal. "I don't think I should. It's not a request, Miss Parker." He glanced up at her, his expression serious but not unkind. "I understand you've been conditioned to expect certain treatment, but things are different here. I prefer we establish that from the start." "Yes, Griffin," she managed, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. He nodded, seemingly satisfied, and gestured to the table. "Sit. Eat." Lydia sat cautiously, watching as Griffin placed bread, cheese, and cold ham before her. He poured her a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, then took a seat across from her. "Go ahead," he encouraged when she hesitated. Lydia picked up a piece of bread, suddenly aware of how hungry she truly was. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing eagerness as Griffin made no move to stop her. "You're wondering what the catch is," he said after a while. Lydia paused mid-bite. "Pardon?" "You're wondering why I'm treating you decently." Griffin's blue eyes held her steadily. "You're waiting for the other boot to drop." She couldn't deny it. People generally want something in return for kindness. "I do want something," he admitted, and Lydia felt her heart sink. Here it was the true reason he'd purchased her contract, but his next words surprised her. "I want to build something here. A real home, not just a place to sleep. That requires help." "What kind of help?" Lydia asked cautiously. "Cooking, cleaning, general household management." He gestured around the kitchen. "I can fend for myself well enough, but I'm better with cattle than cook stoves. Liam helps with the ranch work, but he's just a boy. I need someone who knows how to run a household." Relief washed over Lydia. Household duties were familiar territory, something she could manage confidently. "I can do that." "I thought you might." Griffin took a sip of his coffee. "In return, you'll have decent accommodations, good food, and fair treatment. I won't raise a hand to you no matter what." The promise hung in the air between them, weighty with significance. Lydia wanted desperately to believe him, but experience had made her cautious. "And when my contract ends?" she asked, needing to understand the full scope of their arrangement. "When your contract ends, you'll be free to go wherever you please," Griffin said simply. "Or, if you wish to stay on, we can negotiate terms of employment with actual wages." It sounded too good to be true. Lydia searched his face for signs of deception, but found none. Either Griffin Blackwood was sincere, or he was a better liar than any man she'd ever encountered. "Why did you really buy my contract?" she asked again, still not satisfied with his earlier answer. Griffin set down his coffee cup and considered her question. "When I walked into that store and saw you standing there with blood on your lip, and that look in your eyes like you were beaten but not broken, it reminded me of something." "What?" "Myself, at 16, working for a rancher who thought fists were the best teaching tools." His voice remained level, but Lydia could hear the old pain beneath the words. "No one stepped in for me then. I swore if I ever had the chance to do better, I would. The simple honesty of his explanation resonated with something deep inside Lydia. For the first time since entering his home, she allowed herself to truly hope that perhaps things could be different here. "Thank you," she said softly. Griffin nodded once, then stood. "Finish your meal. Take the rest of the day to settle in. Tomorrow, we can discuss how you'd like to organize the household." "How I'd like to." Lydia couldn't hide her surprise. The corner of Griffin's mouth quirked up in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "It's your domain now, Miss Parker. I imagine you have more expertise in these matters than I do." With that, he left the kitchen, leaving Lydia to ponder this unexpected turn in her life. Freedom within constraints, it wasn't perfect, but it was far more than she'd had yesterday. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was enough to build something new upon. The first week at Blackwood Ranch passed in a blur of activity as Lydia familiarized herself with her new home. True to his word, Griffin gave her complete authority over the household, asking only that meals be ready at reasonable hours and the place kept in decent order. The kitchen was well equipped but disorganized, suggesting that neither Griffin nor Liam had given much thought to efficiency. Lydia spent an entire day rearranging pots, pans, and foodstuffs until everything was easily accessible. She discovered a small vegetable garden behind the house, somewhat neglected but still productive, and immediately set about weeding and tending it. Griffin himself remained something of a mystery. He rose before dawn each day and often didn't return until dusk, busy with the countless tasks required to establish a working ranch. When their paths did cross, he was unfailingly polite but reserved, asking after her comfort but revealing little of himself. Liam, on the other hand, proved to be delightful company. The boy was 14, orphaned 2 years earlier and taken in by Griffin when no one else would have him. His cheerful nature and endless curiosity made him easy to talk to, and he was always eager to help with household chores when not assisting Griffin with the ranch work. "Mr. Blackwood's a good man," Liam told her one evening as they washed dishes together after supper. "Saved my life, he did. Found me half-starved and stealing eggs from a farm near Cheyenne. Instead of turning me in, he gave me a job and a place to stay." "He seems to make a habit of collecting strays," Lydia observed, but there was no bitterness in her tone, only a growing respect for the man who'd purchased her contract. "He believes in second chances," Liam replied with the simple wisdom of youth. "Says everybody deserves at least one." By the end of the first week, Lydia had established a comfortable routine. She rose early to prepare breakfast, spent the morning on household tasks, tended the garden in the afternoon, and prepared supper in the evening. It was hard work, but satisfying in a way that her labor at the Harlow farm never had been. Most surprising was the realization that she was beginning to feel safe. Griffin had kept his promise. Not once had he raised his voice to her, let alone his hand. He'd made no inappropriate advances, demanded no services beyond what they'd initially discussed. He treated her with a quiet respect that was profoundly disarming. On the 8th day, as Lydia was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, she found herself humming softly. The tune, an old folk song her mother had taught her, came naturally, unbidden. When was the last time she'd felt comfortable enough to sing, even quietly to herself? She didn't notice Griffin approaching until his shadow fell across the basket of wet clothes. "Don't stop on my account," he said, reaching down to hand her a clothespin she'd dropped. Lydia felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. "I didn't realize I was making noise. It's a pleasant sound." Griffin leaned against the post supporting the clothesline, like having birds around the place. The compliment, delivered so matter-of-factly, caught her off guard. "Thank you. Griffin nodded, his gaze moving to the freshly weeded garden and the newly organized woodpile nearby. The place is looking better already. I've just tidied up a bit, Lydia said, resuming her task of hanging a shirt on the line. You've done more than that. He gestured toward the house. It feels different inside, more like a home. Lydia felt an unexpected surge of pride at his words. That was my intention. Griffin watched her work for a moment longer, then said, I'm riding into town tomorrow for supplies. Thought you might want to come along. Must be getting tired of these four walls. The offer was tempting, but Lydia hesitated. The last time she'd been in Redemption Creek, she'd been publicly humiliated by Mr. Harlow. The memory still stung. I'm not sure that's wise, she said carefully. People might talk if they see me in town so soon after the change in my circumstances. Let them talk. Griffin's tone hardened slightly. You've done nothing wrong. It's not that simple. Lydia hung another garment, avoiding his gaze. Mr. Harlow has friends in town, influential friends. Are you afraid of him? Griffin asked directly. Lydia considered the question. Not exactly afraid. But he was very angry when you bought my contract. If he saw me in town, appearing, content, it might provoke him. Griffin was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but firm. Hiding gives men like Harlow power they don't deserve. Coming into town with me sends a message that you're under my protection now. The phrase, under my protection, sent an unexpected warmth through Lydia's chest. It had been so long since anyone had been concerned for her safety or well-being. Besides, Griffin added with a hint of humor in his tone, I could use your help selecting fabrics for curtains. The windows in this place look naked. The image of this rugged cowboy contemplating curtain patterns was so incongruous that Lydia couldn't help but laugh, a genuine laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her. The sound surprised her as much as it seemed to please Griffin, whose expression softened noticeably. There it is, he said quietly. What? Lydia asked, still smiling. Your laugh, the one that got you into trouble at Harlow's. Griffin's blue eyes held hers. It's a good sound, worth every penny I paid for that contract. The statement was so unexpected, so strangely touching, that Lydia found herself momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, Griffin straightened and turned to go. We'll leave after breakfast tomorrow, he called over his shoulder. Wear something comfortable for riding. It's a long way to sit in a wagon. As Lydia watched him walk away, she realized that for the first time in years, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The journey into Redemption Creek the next morning was pleasantly uneventful. Griffin had insisted Lydia ride in the wagon seat beside him rather than in the back, treating her more like a companion than a servant. The summer morning was glorious, with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. As they approached the outskirts of town, however, Lydia felt her anxiety rising. She smoothed the front of her dress, one of her better ones, saved for Sundays at the Harlow house, and adjusted the simple straw bonnet that shaded her face. Nervous? Griffin asked, glancing sideways at her. A little, Lydia admitted. Stay close to me, he said simply. It'll be fine. Redemption Creek had grown considerably in the 3 years since Lydia had first arrived. What had once been little more than a trading post now boasted a proper main street with a dozen businesses, including Mr. Diggs's general store, a hotel, a barber shop, and even a small dressmaker's shop. Griffin guided the wagon to a hitching post in front of the general store and set the brake. Before Lydia could move to climb down herself, he was at her side of the wagon, offering his hand to assist her. The gesture, performed in full view of several townspeople walking along the boardwalk, was a clear statement of her position, not as a servant to be relegated to the background, but as someone worthy of courtesy. Lydia placed her hand in his and descended from the wagon, acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. She kept her chin up, refusing to show any sign of discomfort. "Let's start with Diggs," Griffin suggested, gesturing toward the store. "I need tools and nails, and you can look at those fabrics we discussed." Inside the general store, Mr. Diggs was helping an elderly woman select flour. He looked up as they entered, recognition flickering across his face. "Mr. Blackwood," he greeted, then his eyes widened slightly as they fell on Lydia. "And Miss Parker, good to see you both." "Diggs," Griffin returned the greeting with a nod. "We've come for supplies." Of course, of course." The storekeeper finished with his customer, then approached them. "What can I help you with today?" Griffin produced a list from his pocket. "We'll need everything on here, plus whatever Miss Parker requires for the household." Mr. Diggs accepted the list, his gaze darting between them with barely concealed curiosity. "Certainly. Miss Parker, the fabrics and household goods are along the back wall. Feel free to browse while I gather Mr. Blackwood's items." As Lydia moved toward the section indicated, she could feel the weight of stares from the few other customers in the store. News traveled fast in small towns, and everyone would have heard by now that Griffin Blackwood had purchased Harlow's indentured servant. She focused on examining the bolts of fabric, running her fingers over cotton prints and heavier materials suitable for curtains and bedding. After the sparse furnishings of both the Harlow house and her new home at Blackwood Ranch, the simple pleasure of selecting pretty fabrics felt almost decadent. "See anything you like?" Griffin asked, appearing at her side. Lydia indicated a blue and white checked cotton. "This would make nice kitchen curtains, and perhaps this floral print for the parlor windows." Griffin studied the fabrics with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Good choices. Get enough for all the windows and whatever else you think we need." His use of "we" wasn't lost on Lydia. Small as it was, the word suggested partnership rather than ownership, a subtle but significant distinction. Their shopping continued peacefully until the bell above the door jingled, announcing a new arrival. Lydia glanced up automatically, then froze as Harold Harlow stepped into the store. Griffin, noticing her sudden tension, followed her gaze. His posture shifted subtly, his body angling to place himself between Lydia and her former master. Harlow spotted them immediately. His face darkened with anger as he stalked toward them, ignoring Mr. Diggs's cheerful greeting. "Well, well," he sneered, coming to a stop a few feet away. "If it isn't the girl who thinks she's too good for honest work, barely a week gone and already parading around town like a lady." Lydia felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but before she could respond, Griffin stepped forward. "Mr. Harlow," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "I believe our business is concluded. There's no need for further interaction between you and Miss Parker." Harlow's gaze shifted to Griffin, his expression contemptuous. "Blackwood, figured out yet what a mistake you made? That one's got more sass than sense." "On the contrary," Griffin replied coolly, "Miss Parker has proven to be an excellent addition to my household. Your loss, it seems." The implied criticism clearly stung. Harlow's face flushed an ugly red. "She's got you fooled just like she fooled me at first. Wait till she starts getting ideas above her station, laughing at her betters, acting like she's one of them." "Perhaps," Griffin suggested, his tone hardening, "she laughed because you provided ample reason for amusement." A hush fell over the store as everyone present absorbed the insult. Harlow's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You do well to watch your mouth, Blackwood," he growled. "You're new here. Don't know how things work in Redemption Creek." I know how things work anywhere decent men gather, Griffin countered. And striking a woman for the crime of laughter isn't the mark of a decent man. Harlow took a threatening step forward. You calling me indecent? I'm calling you a coward. Griffin didn't move, but something in his stance suggested he was prepared for whatever came next. Only a coward needs to beat someone who can't fight back. For a moment, Lydia thought Harlow might actually throw a punch. His entire body vibrated with rage. But something in Griffin's steady gaze must have given him pause, for he eventually took a step back. You'll regret crossing me, Blackwood, he spat. Both of you will. With that, he turned and stormed out of the store, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was broken by Mr. Diggs clearing his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps I should finish gathering your supplies, Mr. Blackwood. Griffin nodded, his attention returning to Lydia. Are you all right? She realized she was trembling slightly and made a conscious effort to still her hands. Yes, I'm fine. Good. He reached out as if to touch her arm, then seemed to think better of it. Finish selecting what you need. I don't want Harlow to think he's chased us off. As Griffin moved away to speak with Mr. Diggs, Lydia took a deep breath to steady herself. The confrontation had been unpleasant, but Griffin's defense of her so public and unequivocal had left her with a warm glow of gratitude that outweighed her discomfort. They completed their shopping without further incident, though Lydia was aware of whispers and curious glances following them throughout town as they visited the other shops. By early afternoon, the wagon was loaded with supplies, and they were ready to return to the ranch. As they left Redemption Creek behind, Lydia found herself reflecting on how differently she'd entered and left the town today compared to her previous visits with Mr. Harlow. Today, she'd walked beside Griffin rather than 3 steps behind. She'd been consulted on purchases rather than ordered to carry them. She'd been defended rather than demeaned. Thank you, she said quietly as the town disappeared from view behind them. Griffin glanced at her. For what? For what you said to Mr. Harlow. For standing up for me. He shrugged, his eyes returning to the road ahead. I only spoke the truth. Still, no one's done that for me in a very long time. Griffin was silent for so long that Lydia thought he might not respond. When he finally did, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. No one should have to thank another person for basic decency, Lydia. It was the first time he'd used her given name rather than calling her Miss Parker. The unexpected intimacy of it sent a small shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. Perhaps not, she agreed. But I'm thankful all the same. The summer days settled into a comfortable rhythm at Blackwood Ranch. Lydia's skills as a housekeeper transformed the once sparse home into a welcoming haven, with cheerful curtains at the windows and small touches of beauty throughout. She planted additional vegetables in the garden, started a small flower bed near the porch, and even convinced Griffin to invest in a few chickens for fresh eggs. Griffin himself remained busy from dawn until dusk, working tirelessly to establish his cattle operation. He'd arrived with a small herd, just 20 head, but had plans to expand as finances allowed. With Liam's help, he repaired fences, built additional corrals, and prepared the land for the coming winter. Despite their separate domains, Lydia in the house, Griffin on the range, they began to develop a quiet companionship during the evening hours. After supper, when the day's work was done, they often sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and purple. Sometimes they talked of practical matters, repairs needed, supplies running low, weather concerns. Other times they simply sat in comfortable silence, each content with the other's presence. Lydia found herself looking forward to these quiet moments more than she cared to admit. There was something about Griffin's steady presence that made her feel both safe and seen in a way she'd never experienced before. One evening in late August, as they sat watching a spectacular sunset, Griffin broke their companionable silence with an unexpected question. "Were you always indentured, Lydia? Or was there a time before?" The question startled her. They rarely spoke of personal histories, an unspoken agreement that had suited them both thus far. "No," she replied after a moment. "I wasn't always in service. My parents owned a small farm near Denver. We weren't wealthy, but we managed well enough." Griffin nodded, encouraging her to continue. "When I was 19, there was an outbreak of influenza. My parents both fell ill." Lydia's voice softened at the painful memory. "I nursed them as best I could, but they didn't recover." "I'm sorry," Griffin said simply. "After they were gone, I discovered they'd borrowed heavily against the farm. The bank foreclosed almost immediately." Lydia's hands twisted in her lap. "I had nowhere to go, no family to take me in. Mr. Harlow was passing through Denver when he heard about my situation. He offered the indenture contract as a solution room, board, and protection in exchange for 9 years of service." 9 years, Griffin's brow furrowed. "That's an unusually long term." "I didn't know that at the time," Lydia admitted. "I was desperate and ignorant of such matters. It seemed like my only option." Griffin's jaw tightened. "Harlow took advantage of your situation." "Yes," Lydia agreed softly. "I realized that fairly quickly. But by then, the contract was signed and legally binding. And no one stepped in to help, no neighbors or friends of your parents." Lydia shook her head. "The influenza took many in our community. Those who survived were struggling themselves." Griffin fell silent, his gaze returning to the fading sunset. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "When I was 16, my father lost our farm in Missouri to gambling debts. He disappeared one night, leaving my mother and me to face the consequences. We were evicted with nothing but the clothes on our backs." Lydia remained quiet, sensing that this sharing of his past was significant. "My mother found work as a laundress in a nearby town. I took whatever jobs I could find, stable boy, field hand, whatever paid." Griffin's hands, resting on the arms of his chair, tightened into fists. "One rancher offered steady work, but he was a cruel man who used his fists freely. I stayed because the money was good and my mother needed the support." "How long were you there?" Lydia asked gently. 2 years. "Until my mother died of consumption, and there was nothing keeping me tied to that place anymore." His expression darkened with the memory. "I left that same night, headed west with nothing but a change of clothes and my father's old revolver." "And built all this," Lydia gestured to the ranch around them, "from nothing." Griffin's expression softened slightly. "Not entirely from nothing. I had help along the way. Good people who gave me chances I hadn't earned." "Like you've done for Liam," Lydia observed. "And for me." "Different circumstances," Griffin countered. "Liam needed a home, you needed—" "What?" Lydia prompted when he didn't continue. Griffin turned to look at her directly, his blue eyes intense in the fading light. "You needed someone to see your worth." The simple statement, delivered with such conviction, caught Lydia off guard. She felt a warm flush creep up her neck as she held his gaze. "Is that why you really bought my contract?" she asked, returning to the question that had lingered between them since her arrival. "Because you saw something in me worth saving." "I bought your contract," Griffin said slowly, "because when you laughed in that store, despite knowing what it might cost you, I glimpsed something rare, something I wanted to hear again." Before Lydia could respond to this unexpected admission, a distant rumble of thunder drew their attention to the western sky, where dark clouds were gathering above the mountains. "Storm coming," Griffin observed, rising from his chair. "Better secure everything before it hits." the moment whatever it had been passed as practical concerns took precedence. Griffin went to check on the livestock while Lydia hurried inside to close windows and ensure nothing would be damaged by the impending rain. But as she moved through the house, securing it against the storm, Lydia found herself replaying Griffin's words in her mind. The idea that he had seen something valuable in her, something worth preserving, stirred emotions she'd long suppressed for the sake of survival. That night, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the valley, Lydia lay awake in her comfortable bed, listening to the storm and wondering what it might mean to be truly seen by another person after so many years of invisibility. The autumn brought changes to Blackwood Ranch. The aspens turned golden on the hillsides, painting the landscape in hues of amber and bronze. The garden yielded its final harvest, which Lydia preserved for the winter months ahead. Griffin and Liam worked from sunrise to sunset, preparing the ranch and livestock for the harsh Colorado winter that would soon descend from the mountains. Lydia found herself watching Griffin more often than she cared to admit. She noticed the way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he was pleased, but trying not to show it. The careful gentleness with which he treated injured animals. The patience he showed when teaching Liam new skills. The respect with which he always addressed her, never once treating her as less than his equal despite the legal reality of their situation. Something was changing between them, something neither of them acknowledged openly, but which grew more undeniable with each passing day. Their evening conversations on the porch lengthened as the nights grew cooler, often continuing by the fireplace after darkness fell. They spoke of books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they still harbored. Griffin revealed a surprising knowledge of poetry, quoting Wordsworth and Whitman from memory. Lydia shared stories of her childhood, memories she hadn't revisited in years. In early October, Griffin announced he needed to drive his cattle to a lower pasture before the first snowfall. The task would take him and Liam away from the ranch for several days. "Will you be all right here alone?" he asked Lydia the night before their departure, his concern evident. "Of course," she assured him, though the thought of the empty house was less appealing than she cared to admit. "I've plenty to keep me busy." Griffin nodded, but he seemed troubled. "Lock the doors at night and keep my rifle near your bed just in case." "In case of what?" Lydia asked, surprised by his unusual caution. Griffin hesitated before answering. "Probably nothing. But Harlow's been making noises in town, telling anyone who'll listen that I stole what was rightfully his." A cold knot of fear formed in Lydia's stomach. "You think he might come here?" "I think he's all talk," Griffin replied, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "But I'd rather you be prepared than caught off guard." That night, after Griffin and Liam had retired to prepare for their early departure, Lydia sat alone by the fire, contemplating this new information. The possibility that Harold Harlow might still pose a threat hadn't occurred to her. In the safety and comfort of Blackwood Ranch, her former master had begun to seem like a distant, unpleasant memory rather than a present danger. The next morning, Lydia rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for Griffin and Liam before their departure. As they ate, Griffin reviewed his instructions once more. "We should be back within 4 days, 5 at the most," he said, his voice gruff with what Lydia now recognized as concern rather than sternness. "If there's any trouble any at all, fire 3 shots from the rifle. The McCormick's place is within earshot. They'll come to investigate." "I'll be fine," Lydia assured him again, touched by his worry. "The most dangerous thing I plan to do is make apple preserves." Griffin didn't smile at her attempt at humor. Instead, he reached across the table and, for the first time since she'd arrived at the ranch, deliberately took her hand in his. Promise me you'll be careful." The warmth of his calloused palm against hers sent an unexpected thrill through Lydia's body. "I promise." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then released her hand and stood. "We'd better get moving if we want to make it to the south pasture by nightfall." Lydia followed them outside, watching as they mounted their horses and gathered the small herd. As they prepared to ride out, Griffin turned in his saddle to look back at her one last time. 4 days, he called, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like a promise. Lydia nodded, raising her hand in farewell as she watched them disappear down the trail that led toward the distant southern pastures. The first day of solitude passed peacefully enough. Lydia busied herself with household tasks, taking advantage of the men's absence to give the house a thorough cleaning. She sang as she worked, her voice filling the rooms that seemed too quiet without Griffin's deep tones and Liam's cheerful chatter. By the second day, however, the silence had become oppressive. Lydia found herself jumping at small noises, the creak of the house settling, the scratch of branches against a window, the distant cry of a hawk circling above the valley. Griffin's warning about Harlow had planted a seed of anxiety that grew with each passing hour. That night, she brought Griffin's rifle up to her room as he'd suggested, though she'd never fired a gun in her life and wasn't entirely sure she could if the need arose. Still, its presence provided some comfort as she tried to sleep, listening to the wind moan around the eaves of the house. On the third day, Lydia was in the kitchen preparing supper when she heard the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats approaching the house. Her heart leapt with hope. Perhaps Griffin and Liam had completed their task early and were returning home. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to the front window, peering out eagerly. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the rider dismounting in the yard. Not Griffin, but Harold Harlow. For a moment, Lydia stood frozen, watching as her former master tethered his horse to the porch rail and strode toward the house with the confidence of a man who believed he had every right to be there. His face, visible as he approached the porch, wore an unpleasant smile that sent shivers down her spine. The rifle, Lydia remembered suddenly. It was upstairs in her bedroom, too far away to reach before Harlow entered the house. She glanced frantically around the kitchen, looking for anything she could use to defend herself. Her eyes fell on the heavy cast iron skillet sitting on the stove. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The knock when it came was loud and demanding. Lydia remained silent, hoping against hope that Harlow might believe the house was empty and leave. "I know you're in there, girl," Harlow called, his voice carrying easily through the door. "Open up, or I'll break this door down." Lydia's mind raced. If she refused to open the door, he might indeed break in. If she complied, at least she'd have a chance to reason with him, to convince him to leave before Griffin returned. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Lydia approached the door. "What do you want, Mr. Harlow?" "Ah, there you are." His tone was unpleasantly smug. "Open the door so we can talk properly." "I don't think that's necessary," Lydia replied, trying to keep her voice firm despite her fear. "Mr. Blackwood isn't here, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to receive visitors in his absence." There was a pause, then Harlow's voice came again, lower and more threatening. "Open this door now, girl, or you'll regret it when I get inside. And make no mistake, I will get inside." The conviction in his tone told Lydia he meant every word. Reluctantly, she unbolted the door and opened it just wide enough to see him clearly, but not enough to allow him easy entry. Harlow looked much as he had in town, florid-faced and heavy-set, with small eyes that gleamed with malice. He was dressed for riding, his clothes dusty from the trail, and Lydia could smell whiskey on his breath even from where she stood. "That's better," he said, pushing against the door. Lydia held her ground, keeping it partially closed. "Now, why don't you invite me in for a drink?" "It's a long ride from town." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Mr. Harlow," Lydia said, striving to keep her voice steady. "As I said, Mr. Blackwood isn't here, and I don't have the authority to invite guests into his home." Harlow's false smile faded. "Still putting on airs, I see." "Hasn't Blackwood taught you your place yet?" "Mr. Blackwood has been a fair and decent employer," Lydia replied, choosing her words carefully. "Now, please state your business and be on your way." "My business," Harlow spat, all pretense of civility vanishing, "is with you, girl. You've caused me no end of trouble in town. People talking, saying Harlow can't control his own servants, saying Blackwood showed me up. That's hardly my fault. Shut up." Harlow's hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the door and shoving it hard. Unprepared for the sudden force, Lydia stumbled backward, and Harlow used the opportunity to push his way inside. Lydia retreated, putting the kitchen table between them. "You need to leave, Mr. Harlow. Now." "I'll leave when I'm good and ready," he growled, glancing around the house with undisguised contempt. "So this is where Blackwood's keeping you, playing house like you're some kind of lady instead of contract-bound property." "My contract was legally transferred," Lydia reminded him, edging sideways toward the stove where the heavy skillet still sat. "You have no claim on me anymore. That's where you're wrong." Harlow took a step toward her, his expression darkening. "Blackwood may have the paper, but I've filed a complaint with the county clerk. Said the sale was made under duress, that he threatened me. It's his word against mine, and I've lived in this county a lot longer than he has." Lydia's heart sank at this revelation. While she doubted Harlow could actually reclaim her contract through such means, the very attempt could cause serious legal complications for Griffin. "What do you want?" she asked again, her hand closing around the handle of the skillet as she kept the table between them. "I want what's mine," Harlow snarled, moving suddenly to circle the table. "And if I can't have that, I'll settle for teaching you and your new master a lesson about respect." As he lunged toward her, Lydia swung the skillet with all her strength. It connected with Harlow's outstretched arm with a sickening thud, and he howled in pain, staggering backward. "You little bitch," he roared, cradling his injured arm. "I'll kill you for that." Lydia didn't wait to see if he meant it. She darted past him, heading for the stairs and the rifle in her bedroom. Behind her, she heard Harlow recover and give chase, his heavy footsteps thundering after her. She had just reached the landing when his hand closed around her ankle. Lydia fell hard on the stairs, the breath knocked from her lungs. Before she could recover, Harlow was upon her, his weight pinning her down as his hands closed around her throat. "Should have beaten that spirit out of you years ago," he growled, his face inches from hers as he squeezed. "Blackwood won't want you when I'm done." Lydia fought desperately, clawing at his hands, trying to break his grip as black spots began to dance before her eyes. Just as consciousness began to fade, the front door crashed open with a splintering of wood. "Get your hands off her." Griffin's voice roared from the entryway, cold and deadly as a mountain winter. Harlow's grip loosened in surprise, and Lydia gasped for air as her vision cleared enough to see Griffin standing at the foot of the stairs, his revolver aimed steadily at Harlow's head. "Blackwood," Harlow sneered, though he slowly released Lydia and raised his hands. "This isn't what it looks like." "It looks like you're assaulting a woman in my home," Griffin replied, his voice terrifyingly calm despite the fury evident in his eyes. "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't put a bullet in you right now." Harlow began to edge down the stairs, away from Lydia. "The woman is legally bound by contract. I have reason to believe that contract was transferred improperly. I came to discuss the matter." "With your hands around her throat," Griffin's finger tightened visibly on the trigger. Try again. Lydia managed to pull herself to a sitting position on the stairs, one hand gingerly touching her bruised throat. He said he's filed a complaint with the county clerk, she rasped. Claims you threatened him during the sale. Griffin's jaw tightened, but his aim never wavered. Is that so? The law will side with me, Harlow declared, though his bravado seemed forced now that he was facing Griffin's steady gun. I have friends in this county, important friends. So do I, Griffin replied evenly. Sheriff Davis, for one, who will be very interested to hear how you broke into my home and assaulted Miss Parker in my absence. Harlow's face paled slightly. You can't prove anything. It's your word against mine. And hers, Griffin nodded toward Lydia. And the McCormicks, who saw you ride onto my property, and whoever else you passed on your way here. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Harlow's face. He had reached the bottom of the stairs now and stood just a few feet from Griffin, whose revolver remained unwavering. Here's what's going to happen, Griffin said, his voice deadly quiet. You're going to leave my property now. You're going to withdraw your complaint with the county clerk, and you're going to stay away from Miss Parker and everyone associated with this ranch for the rest of your miserable life. And if I don't, Harlow challenged, though his voice lacked conviction, then I'll kill you. The simple statement, delivered without heat or emphasis, was all the more chilling for its matter-of-fact tone. Not today, not where it could be called murder, but someday when you least expect it. And they'll never find enough of you to bury. A long, tense silence followed as the two men stared at each other. Finally, Harlow looked away. This isn't over, Blackwood, he muttered, but the threat sounded hollow even to Lydia's ears. Yes, it is, Griffin countered. Now get out before I forget I'm a civilized man. Harlow hesitated only a moment longer before moving toward the door, giving Griffin a wide berth. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at Lydia, still sitting on the stairs. You always were more trouble than you were worth, he spat. Griffin took a step toward him, and Harlow hastily retreated, disappearing through the broken doorway. Moments later, they heard the sound of hoofbeats as he galloped away from the ranch. Only when the sound had faded completely did Griffin lower his revolver. He crossed to the bottom of the stairs in 2 long strides, his expression transforming from cold fury to concern as he looked up at Lydia. Are you hurt? He asked, holstering his weapon and climbing the stairs to kneel beside her. Just bruised, Lydia managed, her voice still raspy from Harlow's assault. How did you know? You weren't supposed to be back until tomorrow. Something didn't feel right, Griffin admitted, his fingers gently brushing her hair back to examine the marks on her throat. We pushed hard to get the herd settled quickly. Liam's taking care of the horses now. The gentleness of his touch, the genuine concern in his eyes, and the knowledge that he'd rushed back because of some instinct to protect her, combined to break the dam of emotion Lydia had been holding back. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks as delayed shock set in. Without hesitation, Griffin gathered her into his arms, cradling her against his chest as she sobbed. You're safe now, he murmured into her hair. I've got you. You're safe. Lydia clung to him, the solid warmth of his body an anchor in the storm of her emotions. His heart beat steadily beneath her ear, his arms secure around her trembling form. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. When her tears finally subsided, Griffin didn't immediately release her. Instead, he shifted to sit beside her on the stairs, keeping one arm around her shoulders. I should have been here, he said, his voice rough with self-recrimination. I knew Harlow was making threats. I shouldn't have left you alone. This isn't your fault, Lydia insisted, wiping the last traces of tears from her face. You couldn't have known he'd actually come here. Griffin's expression darkened. I underestimated his stupidity. That won't happen again. What will you do? Lydia asked, suddenly worried that Griffin might seek retribution that could land him in legal trouble. First, I'm taking you into town tomorrow to see the doctor, Griffin said firmly. Those bruises need to be documented. Then we're visiting Sheriff Davis to file charges against Harlow for trespassing and assault. Will that be enough? Lydia wondered aloud. He seemed confident his friends would protect him. They might try, Griffin acknowledged, but Harlow made a critical mistake today. He attacked you in my home on my property. That changes things, legally speaking. And what about his complaint about the contract? Griffin's arm tightened around her shoulders. Let him try to pursue that. I have the bill of sale signed and witnessed. More importantly, I have friends of my own, including Judge Wilson, who happens to despise men who abuse their authority over others. For the first time since Harlow's arrival, Lydia felt the knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. If Griffin believed they could resolve this legally, perhaps the nightmare truly was over. You know, Griffin said after a moment, his tone lighter, you did a fair job defending yourself. That's quite a dent in Harlow's arm from that skillet of yours. Despite everything, Lydia found herself smiling at the memory. I was aiming for his head. Griffin chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her side. Remind me never to make you angry in the kitchen. Their laughter, shared in the aftermath of danger, created an intimacy that neither of them seemed willing to break. They sat together on the stairs, Griffin's arm still around Lydia's shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him, until Liam's voice called from outside, announcing his return. Only then did they separate, though something fundamental had changed between them, something that would need to be addressed when the immediate crisis had passed. For now, though, Lydia was content with the knowledge that she was safe, that Griffin had come for her when she needed him most, and that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The following weeks brought significant changes to Redemption Creek. True to his word, Griffin took Lydia to the doctor the day after Harlow's attack, ensuring that her injuries were properly documented. Their visit to Sheriff Davis resulted in a warrant being issued for Harlow's arrest on charges of trespassing, breaking and entering, and assault. To everyone's surprise, however, Harlow was nowhere to be found. He had fled Redemption Creek sometime during the night, abandoning his property and outstanding debts. Rumors suggested he'd headed for Wyoming territory, beyond the immediate reach of Colorado law. He'll turn up eventually, Sheriff Davis assured them. Men like Harlow can't stay out of trouble for long. When he does, we'll be waiting. With the immediate threat removed, life at Blackwood Ranch settled into a new rhythm. The seasons turned, and winter descended upon the Colorado mountains, blanketing the valley in pristine white. Inside the farmhouse, warmth and comfort prevailed as Lydia transformed their home into a haven against the cold. Yes, their home, for that was how she had come to think of it. In the aftermath of Harlow's attack, the nature of Lydia's relationship with Griffin had shifted subtly, but significantly. They no longer maintained the careful distance that had marked their earlier interactions. Their evening conversations by the fire grew longer and more personal. Occasionally, Griffin's hand would find hers as they sat together, a quiet acknowledgement of feelings neither of them had yet put into words. Christmas approached, bringing with it a festive spirit that Lydia hadn't experienced since before her parents' deaths. She decorated the house with pine boughs and red ribbons, baked cookies and pies that filled the rooms with delicious aromas, and even persuaded Griffin to help her find and cut the perfect tree to stand in the parlor window. On Christmas Eve, after Liam had gone to bed, his head full of excited anticipation for the small gifts Lydia had wrapped and placed beneath the tree. She and Griffin sat alone by the fire. Outside, snow fell gently, adding to the already substantial drifts that surrounded the house. "I have something for you," Griffin said, reaching into his pocket. "I was going to wait until tomorrow, but, well, this seems like the right moment." He withdrew a small object and held it out to Lydia. It was a folded document sealed with the official stamp of the county clerk's office. "What is this?" Lydia asked, accepting it with curiosity. "Open it," Griffin encouraged, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. Lydia broke the seal and unfolded the document. As she read its contents, her eyes widened in disbelief. "This is my indenture contract," she said slowly, looking up at Griffin with confusion. "But it's marked fulfilled and dissolved." Griffin nodded, his blue eyes intent on her face. "I filed the paperwork last week. Judge Wilson expedited it himself. But how? I still have years remaining on the term." "I paid it off," Griffin said simply. "Every remaining penny of the original debt, plus interest. According to the law, you're now a free woman, Lydia, no longer bound by contract to anyone." Lydia stared at the document in her hands, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what Griffin had done. Freedom, true freedom after so many years of servitude. It seemed impossible, yet the official seal and signatures made it undeniably real. "Why?" she whispered, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Why would you do this?" Griffin leaned forward in his chair, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Because I want you to stay, Lydia. Not because a piece of paper says you must, but because you choose to. You want me to continue working here?" Lydia asked, trying to understand the full implications of his gesture. "No." Griffin reached for her hands, enfolding them and the document they held in his larger ones. "I want you to continue living here with me, but not as my housekeeper or servant, as my partner, my equal." Lydia's heart began to race as the meaning behind his words became clear. "Griffin, are you?" "I love you, Lydia Parker," he said, the words emerging with the force of long-suppressed emotion. "I think I've loved you since that first day in Diggs's store, when you had the courage to laugh despite the consequences. I want to spend the rest of my life hearing that laugh, if you'll let me." Tears welled in Lydia's eyes, not tears of sorrow or fear, but of overwhelming joy. "I love you too," she admitted, her voice catching. "I have for so long, but I never dared hope." Griffin released her hands only to cup her face gently between his palms. "Hope now," he whispered, and then he was kissing her, his lips warm and tender against hers. Lydia melted into his embrace, her arms winding around his neck as she returned his kiss with all the love she'd kept hidden in her heart. When they finally parted, both breathless and smiling, Griffin rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not because any contract says you should, but because we choose each other freely and completely." "Yes," Lydia answered without hesitation. "Yes, with all my heart." Griffin's smile was radiant as he kissed her again, sealing their promise to one another. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their world in pristine white, a fitting symbol for the fresh beginning they would share together. They were married on the first day of spring, when the snow had retreated from the valley, and the first wildflowers were beginning to dot the meadows around Blackwood Ranch. The ceremony was small but joyful, held on their own front porch with Judge Wilson officiating and half the town in attendance. Liam stood proudly as Griffin's best man, beaming with happiness at the union that would make their little family official. Mrs. McCormick, who had become a dear friend to Lydia over the winter months, served as her matron of honor. Lydia wore a simple dress of pale blue silk, her first new dress in years, ordered specially from Denver for the occasion. As she walked toward Griffin, who waited for her with undisguised adoration in his eyes, she felt a sense of completion that she had never thought possible. "You are the most beautiful sight I've ever seen," Griffin whispered as she reached his side. "Even more beautiful than your cattle herd." Lydia teased, her happiness too great to contain. Griffin's laugh, that deep, rumbling sound she had come to cherish, rang out across the yard. "Infinitely more beautiful," he assured her, taking her hand in his. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, spoken with the absolute certainty of two people who had found in each other not just love, but understanding, respect, and the promise of a future built together, choice by choice, day by day. When Judge Wilson pronounced them husband and wife, Griffin gathered Lydia into his arms and kissed her with such tenderness that several of the ladies present dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even Sheriff Davis, standing at the back of the crowd, was seen to wipe suspiciously at his weathered cheek. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing on the grass before the house. As twilight descended and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Griffin led Lydia away from their guests to the quiet of the porch steps. "Happy?" he asked, his arm secure around her waist. Lydia leaned her head against his shoulder, watching as fireflies began to sparkle in the gathering dusk. "More than I ever dreamed possible." Griffin pressed a kiss to her temple. "You know, I bought your contract just to hear you laugh again, but I got so much more than I bargained for." "As did I," Lydia agreed, turning to face her husband, with a smile that illuminated her entire being. "Who would have thought that laughter could lead to this? I think," Griffin said thoughtfully, "that laughter is just the beginning. We have a lifetime of joy ahead of us, Mrs. Blackwood." "A lifetime," Lydia echoed, savoring the words and the promise they held. "That sounds perfect." And as Griffin lowered his lips to hers once more, Lydia knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, equal partners in the life and love they had chosen to build. 10 years later, Blackwood Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous properties in the county. The original farmhouse had been expanded to accommodate their growing family twin daughters, Grace and Hope, now 8 years old, and a son, James, who had just celebrated his 5th birthday. Liam, no longer a boy but a capable young man of 24, had become Griffin's foreman, managing a crew of ranch hands who tended to the substantial herd that now grazed the expanded Blackwood holdings. He lived in a small cabin on the property, though he still took most of his meals with the family that had become his own in all the ways that truly mattered. On a warm summer evening, much like the one when Griffin had first brought Lydia to the ranch, the family gathered on the expanded front porch after supper. The children played an elaborate game of their own invention on the lawn, their laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. Griffin and Lydia sat side by side in matching rocking chairs, watching their offspring with contentment. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Lydia asked, her hand finding Griffin's as it had countless times over the years. Griffin's fingers entwined with hers automatically, the gesture as natural as breathing after a decade of marriage. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I can't imagine any path that wouldn't have led me to you eventually." Lydia smiled at his romantic declaration. 10 years together had softened some of Griffin's rough edges, but had done nothing to diminish his devotion to her. If anything, their love had deepened with each passing year, strengthened by shared joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. "Have you heard the news from town?" she asked, changing the subject. Griffin nodded, his expression growing more serious. "Sheriff Davis mentioned it when I was in yesterday. Harlow's been caught finally, over in Cheyenne. Tried to pull the same tricks there that he did here, but his luck ran out. Harold Harlow had remained a fugitive for years, always staying one step ahead of the law. His name had occasionally surfaced in reports of swindles and confidence schemes across the territories, but he had never returned to Redemption Creek. Will they bring him back here to face charges? Lydia wondered. Probably not, Griffin replied. He's wanted for worse crimes in Wyoming. Davis says he'll likely spend the rest of his days in prison there. Lydia absorbed this news with a sense of finality. The specter of Harold Harlow had long since ceased to haunt her daily thoughts, but there was still satisfaction in knowing that justice, however delayed, had finally been served. "Mama, Papa, look." Their eldest daughter, Grace, called from the lawn. She was attempting to teach her younger brother how to cartwheel, with limited success. James tumbled onto the grass, giggling uncontrollably at his own failure. "Careful with your brother, Grace," Lydia cautioned, though she couldn't help smiling at their antics. "He's fine, Mama," Hope, Grace's twin and the more practical of the two, assured her. "We're teaching him proper falling techniques first." Griffin chuckled at this solemn pronouncement. "Your daughters have your intelligence and my stubbornness. Heaven help us when they're teenagers." "And James has your charm and my curiosity," Lydia added, watching as their son, undeterred by his failed cartwheel, immediately attempted another. "We'll have our hands full with all of them." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Griffin said, his gaze moving from their children to Lydia's face. Even after 10 years, he still looked at her with the same wonder and appreciation that he had on their wedding day. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in breathtaking hues of gold and crimson, Lydia found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of servitude and fear to the heights of love and family, a transformation that had begun with a simple, defiant laugh in a general store a lifetime ago. "Neither would I," she agreed, leaning over to kiss her husband softly. "Neither would I." And as their children's laughter floated around them in the gathering twilight, Lydia knew that this love, this family, this life they had built together was the greatest freedom of all.